This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Long Tan, a conflict fought on foreign soil between Australia and the Viet Cong. Having been a recipient of the Battle of Long Tan, I wanted to understand the importance and history behind this important Australian battle. It was through my research did I realise there was such a war which Australian men would return home not being recognised as serving their country and looked down upon by society. It was the first war to ever be televised. Media became a significant part as well as moratoriums against the war. Never has a war been so controversial. I dedicate my video to past Vietnam veterans.
Who didn't accept them were perhaps people who had served in World War I and World War II and didn't really consider Vietnam as a war. They were certainly conscious of what their contribution was in World War I and World War II, and to them the skirmish in Vietnam really didn't compare in any way, shape or form. But as I've spoken to many World War II diggers and have said to them that the lead that was going over their head was exactly the same as what was going over ours. Just an entirely different arena that we were fighting in, but certainly in no way any different as far as war.
I think the most controversial that really hurt me was the way the university students carried on moratoriums and protesting about Vietnam, and they were making out us as soldiers that we were women killers and molesters and child killers. That's the part that really hurt.
Most controversy was around the fact of whether we should be there or not. There was a large number of people in society questioning why we should be fighting a war in foreign lands over issues that they didn't feel were close to home. So I had a brother who is a Vietnam veteran, and clearly that was the outstanding issue at the time that attracted the greatest level of controversy.
In the way that we became involved initially, aspects of conscription and national service, first television war, where it was regularly on the TV screens in the 6 o'clock news. So there was no delay in information getting back. Not only did it have an effect on those who served in Vietnam initially, but also had an effect on commemorations and remembrance of the activities of those that had gone before us in relation to World War I and World War II, Korea and Malaya. Generation didn't do that, of course, and that's now changed, where commemoration activities such at any time have vast numbers.
Or that the attitude changed substantially. In fact, probably if there was any change, there was more resentment as the war went along. There were more protests and there were more people putting their hand up saying we don't want our boys over there anymore. Now that had a substantial impact as the groundswell for that line of thinking got greater, and of course I think then it continued on when our troops came home. The public were concerned, I think in many cases they couldn't understand why we were there. They certainly probably had very little idea what we were doing, and of course one thing led to another, and before you know where you're going, the poor guys were getting home and they were being treated very, very poorly.
Family effects were very, very hard, and our people didn't know where they were. Wives were worried, girlfriends were worried. It took a long while for mail to get there and mail to get back to Australia, and it was just frustrating overall.
Well, I think in many ways people still have divided opinions in relation to the Vietnam War. You talk to some people who will say it was the biggest mistake that we made in relation to committing to that war. There are other people who believe that we had a role to play and a duty to play with our allies in relation to taking up the fight, if you like. So community, I guess, sentiments are still largely divided as they were in the past. What I think has changed though is the attitude towards returned servicemen who fought in Vietnam. There was a mixed response when they initially came home, but I think that that's very much changed now. As stated, some people saw it as our duty to be there. Others thought that we shouldn't be there, and conscription obviously, I guess, elevated those levels of angst amongst families and people who didn't believe we had a role to play in that battle. So whilst there were always some underlying levels of opposition and varying sentiments, conscription certainly played a role in exacerbating those and heightening, I guess, those concerns and those levels of angst within the community.
Conscription was probably seen as a good thing by many people. I think the aspect of young people going into the army and having some discipline and being taught how to be mates with other people and work as a team and a group, I think generally that was probably considered to be a good thing. When we committed to Vietnam and our national service people were going over there, I think the rules changed and the public didn't really see that these young people from Australia who really didn't necessarily want to be soldiers were now put into a situation where they were fighting in a war that the public really didn't see as being any relevance anyway.
It was a big help. I was regular army, but they had the same training we did, and they were just as good as soldiers. There was no difference between the regular soldier and the conscript. We all had the same training and we all done the same job.
The way they had left their communities for 2 years, came home, they were discharged, the people came back and they went to the local pub for the first beer, and their mates said, "Where have you been for the last couple of years?" And so there was this entering their communities, and it occurred in World War I. If you've got the same issues and problems, was fitting back into a community that had gone through a war, lived with all the issues, and these guys then turned up. Basically wanted to start their lives again, but they'd lost 4 years.
I think that the community perceptions changed when the war was on. From what I've read, there was, I guess the casualties mounted, there was a greater number of people questioning our presence. What are we doing there? Why are our next generation of young men losing their lives?
After embarking on this journey, I have gained a perspective of the Vietnam War that many do not have. So many young men made a sacrifice to protect the Australia that we live in today. They did the same things as the original Anzacs. They went, they did their job, and there were underlying problems at home. This also occurred in other wars. There is no difference between the symbols used in World War I, those at Vietnam, and those that continue to serve today. Each of us are a living legacy of the courage and sacrifices made by young Australians, and I promise to pass on their legacies. I do not take the sacrifices they have made for granted, and nor should future generations. Your sacrifice and courage will never be forgotten.